Hello friends, or perhaps I should say greetings witnesses to the dawning of the machine age. I'm Thomas Waters and welcome to my video series on revolutions and the making of the modern world. This series is about the history of revolutions over the past 2.5 centuries. Today I won't be talking about political revolutions, about dramatic attempts to seize power and use it. Instead, I'll be discussing revolutions in the secondary and wider sense of the term, as processes that bring about fundamental economic, social and cultural change. The specific fundamental economic, social and cultural transformation that I want to talk to you about on this occasion is the Industrial Revolution. I should say at the start that I mean the original and first Industrial Revolution, the one that took place in Britain during the later 18th and early 19th centuries, a time of coal, steam and water power, an era of great iron, cotton and mining industries, the age of great cities, newspapers and railways, as contemporaries variously referred to it, when Britain could plausibly be called the workshop of the world, and when its economic output per head was discernibly higher than in any other nation. When in just a few decades, previously quiet villages like Middlesbrough and Barrow-in-Furness grew into smoky but prosperous industrial towns, and other cities and towns rapidly expanded. I suppose I shouldn't completely avoid statistics, even in what's intended to be an evocative introductory video. So here goes. To give you a sense of the pace of urbanisation in England alone during the Industrial Revolution, consider this. During the second half of the 18th century, England had 8% of Europe's population, but it had 70% of Europe's urban growth. But just how revolutionary was Britain's first industrial revolution? How fundamental were the alterations, in other words, that it brought into effect? A change to which the history of the old world furnishes no parallel has taken place in our country. So wrote the Whig politician and best-selling historian Thomas Babington Macaulay in 1848. His emphasis on the not just enormous but qualitatively unprecedented nature of change was by no means a singular view. Listen to this summary by the German businessman and revolutionary Friedrich Engels, which he made in 1845 in his book The Condition of the Working Class in England. The history of England's industrial development in the past 60 years is a history which has no counterpart in the annals of humanity. 60, 80 years ago, England was a country like every other, with small towns, few and simple industries, and a thin but proportionately large agricultural population. Today, it is a country like no other. Now, those are certainly striking claims, but perceptions, of course, don't always simply match or reflect reality. Novelty is often overstated, and I think that early 19th century people, like Engels and Thomas Macaulay, generally overestimated the importance of new and original developments and underestimated the persistence and tenacity of older dynamics in the economy and society. This was particularly so with the impact of new technology and machines. It is the age of machinery, wrote the Scottish historian and author Thomas Carlyle in 1829. Nothing is now done directly or by hand. All is by rule and calculated contrivance. The living artisan is driven from his workshop to make room for a speedier, inanimate one. Enormous, elaborate machines were the centrepieces of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it's true that new machines were vitally important in the factory-based textile industries that were booming around Manchester and in West Yorkshire. Machines in the form of new pumps were critical in Britain's mines too, in the great coalfields that were opening up across much of the country, but particularly in South Wales. From there came the coal that replaced wood as the method of heating most of Britain's homes. Coal also provided huge amounts of fossil fuel energy that, during the later 19th century at least, allowed for discernibly higher levels of consumption among the working population. And of course, this coal released vast amounts of carbon, which began the human-induced climate warming that seriously threatens us today. But back to the Industrial Revolution. Machines mattered, and so did factories, as sites both of technology and new work disciplinary regimes, as at Josiah Wedgwood's ceramics factory opened in Stoke-on-Trent in 1769, which included a novel clocking on and off system. Yet though factories and machines mattered, so, to a considerable extent throughout the Industrial Revolution, did artisanal labour, small-scale production, sweated industries, as they were called, and the pure muscle power of both humans and animals. Even in Lancashire, in the epicentre of cotton production, which was much more factory-orientated than any other industry, only 25 of the county's 975 spinning and weaving firms employed more than 1,000 people in 1841. The average number of employees, I should say, was 193. In Birmingham, small-scale artisan production was the norm until at least the 1850s. Steam power, which is often seen as emblematic of early Victorian industry, was less important as a power source than water until the 1870s. Note also that some areas, like the old woolen producing districts in Wiltshire, Norfolk and the Cotswolds, actually underwent deindustrialisation during this period, thanks to the effects of competition from home and abroad. To be fair, the art and literature of late Georgian and Victorian Britain reflects the extent to which new technology-driven mass production grew alongside, rather than replacing, muscle power and the artisanal workshop. We remember William Blake's Dark Satanic Mills, Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, and Turner's iconic oil painting, Rain, Steam and Speed, where you can almost smell and feel the train rush by. But we also have the immortal celebration of labour that is Ford Madox Brown's work, or the combination of human and machine that's so luminously displayed in Joseph Wright of Derby's and Ironforge. Remember also the telling fact that in 1914, on the eve of the First World War, and almost 90 years after the first steam-driven public railway opened between Darlington and Stockton, there were more horses on Britain's roads than ever before. So the first Industrial Revolution, in its British incarnation at least, was an era of factories and workshops, artisans, animals and machines. Now there are many other ways in which the contemporary hyperbole about living in a fundamentally new age or new era was overblown, and I can only really touch on a handful of those now. One perhaps surprising feature of the period was that the rate of economic growth was pretty slow by historical standards, and certainly compared with the amazing recent industrialisation of China. I'd like to also underline one vital continuity in the British economy during and beyond the period of the Industrial Revolution. That continuity is associated with the land market, with the neo-feudal, I suppose you might call it, dynamic of productivity increases, profits and the economic surplus finding their way not just into increased standards of living or into supporting higher levels of population, but into unearned capital gains and rent increases for the owners of land. We can see this at work in some of the great urban estates owned by 19th century aristocrats like the Dukes of Portland, Westminster and others. They made vast fortunes simply from the fact that urbanisation, industrialisation and population growth increased the demand for housing. The other side of these labour-free gains was for the working people of Britain, who were obliged to pay large proportions of their wages in rents for overcrowded and poor quality accommodation. Industrialisation didn't solve this problem of housing poverty. Actually, it exacerbated it. The cure, or amelioration at least, came in the 20th century as liberal and social democratic governments regulated rents and built huge amounts of public housing. By way of conclusion, I'd like to note that these neo-feudal dynamics of the economic surplus finding its way into the land market, they've reasserted themselves and indeed have been supercharged since the 1970s onset of the economic paradigm that's sometimes called neoliberalism. I'll leave you with this final fact. In the 1880s and 1890s, in the working class districts of outcast London, as it was sometimes called, it became a scandal that working people were paying around a third of their wages on rent for overcrowded flats and houses. Today, in the same areas, and sometimes in the very same buildings, it's not unusual for the working people of London, particularly younger workers, to pay half or even two-thirds of their earnings in rent to landlords who've also in recent decades enjoyed lottery-winning sums in capital gains. This, perhaps, speaks to the extent that, in Britain, an industrial capitalism focused on production has been overtaken by a finance capitalism devoted to rent extraction.